web. Tune in every Friday at noon Eastern Time for insights and stories on the nuances of running small business right here on Fridays at noon, talkradio.nyc.
Do you love or are you intrigued about New York City and its neighborhoods? I'm Jeff Goodman, host of Rediscovering New York, a weekly show that showcases New York's history and its extraordinary neighborhoods. Every Tuesday live at 7 p.m., we focus on a particular neighborhood and explore its history, its vibe, its feel, and its energy. Tune in live every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on talkradio.nyc.
Did you know that nearly 1 in 5 adults in the U.S. battles mental illness? Hi, my name is Albert Daba. I'm the host of the show Extra Innings. Extra Innings, I discuss the topics of wellness, mental health, and the experience of surviving multiple suicides within my family. Listen live every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern to Extra Innings for discussions with sports figures, artists, mental health professionals, many others. That's Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern on talkradio.nyc.
In a post-COVID world, you may have many unanswered questions regarding your health. Are you looking to live a healthier lifestyle? Do you have a desire to learn more about mental health and enhance your quality of life? Or do you just want to participate in self-understanding and awareness? I'm Frank R. Harrison, host of Frank About Health, and each Thursday, I will tackle these questions and work to enlighten you. Tune in every Thursday at 5 p.m. on talkradio.nyc, and I will be Frank About Health to advocate for all of us.
Howdy, I am Joseph Franklin McElroy, host of the new podcast, Gateway to the Smokies. It airs on talkradio.nyc every Tuesday night from 6 p.m. to 7. Every episode is dedicated to memorable experiences in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and surrounding areas. This show features experts and locals who expound upon the richness of culture, history, and adventure that awaits you in the Smokies. Tune in every Tuesday from 6 p.m. to 7 on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
Take two. Okay, good evening. Welcome to Employment Law Today. I'm your host, Eric Sauver. I'm an employment law and business law attorney, and I host this weekly live talk radio show every Tuesday night at 5 p.m. right here on Talk Radio NYC, where I have guests who discuss some of the most novel, complex, and cutting-edge issues that business owners and employers and employees face in these complex times. We touch upon issues of discrimination, employee engagement, labor laws, COVID-19, and we do it with some resources and guidance for those listening. So in the spirit of my show, I'm very pleased tonight to welcome our guest, Ms. Emily Williams. Emily is a coach, consultant, also for advocate for women of color in the workforce, and she's founded Forward Ever Global. So Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Eric. I'm happy to be here.
Great, happy to have you. I have to chuckle because I think I was telling you about the muting, that you're muted before we start, so don't forget to unmute, and then I was on mute. So, but just kind of little humor there. But I want to share out with the audience tonight the topic that we're going to discuss, and then I'll give you a more proper introduction of your background and your qualifications, your impressive work history. So our topic, folks, is COVID-19, women of color, and the dual pandemic. And Emily and I were speaking about COVID-19 with its ever-changing variants, its twists and turns, which have undoubtedly taken a very harsh toll on the economy, on labor shortages in the workforce, and on the collective and the individual mental health of our society. But the pandemic of discrimination, of implicit bias and overt bias, has been exacerbated by COVID, particularly against people of color and women of color in the workforce. And so on tonight's episode of Employment Law Today, my guest, Emily Williams, DEI consultant, coach, and advocate for women of color, and founder of Forward Ever Global, and I will discuss this disproportionate impact of COVID-19. How has it impacted women of color in the workforce? What is the perspective of employees who live this daily reality? So we'll also discuss some of the patterns that Emily has seen in her work. And speaking of Emily, I just want to give you that introduction that I mentioned to welcome you to the show. Emily Williams is a coach and a consultant dedicated to addressing the issues of work that most negatively impact women of color. Emily has led and designed diversity policies on national and global stages, including a global treaty to end gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work, which was adopted by the United Nations. Emily has worked with organizations and community stakeholders to further the equity and inclusion in more than 20 countries. With a background in labor and human rights, Emily advises organizational leaders on how to build company cultures that model racial and gender equity. Emily Williams specializes in addressing microaggressions in the workplace and in coaching women of color to thrive despite the everyday challenges at work. She founded Forward Ever Global LLC after a 15-year career in the social sector, where she led organizations through change and established multiple diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Emily served as president of the board of directors for Fathering Together, and she is a member of the board of advisors for women of color in the workplace. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Beloit College and a Master of Arts in Women's and Gender Studies from DePaul University. So again, Emily, with that backdrop of yours and just your passion for this topic, I'm really thrilled to have you on the show tonight.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, I'm definitely happy to be here. It's an
Great.
important topic.
Yes, it certainly is. So before we jump right into the topic, I just want to get a little more background about yourself. I find this to be an interesting starting point, I think, how people get to where they are. So I'm wondering, if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself, specifically, Emily, how did your career initially start out? And then what prompted you to start your own business and become a coach and an advocate for women of color in the workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question.
Sure.
Well, my first job out of college was working with adults with severe and persistent mental illness. From there, and then from there, I became a classroom teacher. And after that, I went back to get my degree in women's and gender studies. And from that point on, I was really able to make gender and racial equity central to my career. And so I've been fortunate to work with many organizations, both as an employee and as a consultant, to make equity central to an organization's culture, mission, and vision. So that's a bit about my career history.
Sure.
Yeah, and then I became, I've always been an advocate for people of color and for women of color, but to take it on as my full-time job as an entrepreneur is that I had experienced toxic working environments. And I experienced treatment that I felt rose to the level of harassment. And it became very real for me when I had been working with women leaders from 13 countries to address gender-based violence in the world of work. I would often do trainings, lead workshops in which I would encourage women, to name the violence that was happening at work and then to advocate for policies to address that problem.
Right.
So when I realized that the treatment that I was experiencing, was more than a coincidental series of decisions that had had a negative impact on me, and instead that I was being targeted, I realized that I too had to speak up about what was happening and then propose policies to address the problem. And then in that process, I learned that it wasn't just me, right? That women of color generally are the most harassed of anyone, right? And that's across industries and that's across sectors. So my advocacy led to not only changes in my particular experience, but it improved the culture for other people of color. And it also strengthened the company's diversity, equity, and inclusion program. So I started my coaching and consulting practice, one, because I want women of color to know that they have more options than to simply suffer through a toxic working environment or to leave.
Right.
And then, I want to encourage organizations to really build workplace cultures where people of color and women of color can thrive. And I want them to know that that too is in their best interest.
Yes. Well, let me say first off, Emily, first and foremost, I'm sorry for your experience of the toxic and discriminatory workplace that you described there, in your background, your history. It's like, I've seen that a lot of my guests on the show, it's like a lot of them, they've been motivated to action or called to action and passionate about what they do, often based on their own, say, painful experiences in a situation that maybe either heighten their awareness and say, this is what's happening to me and others, or it's a form of suffering that I think to be able to transform suffering into meaning by doing service, based on that suffering is really something. So I've seen that very often with guests of mine. They've experienced some kind of trauma, and it inspires them to act, and it builds their passion and their compassion, which I'm sure you had before you embarked on the endeavor with Forward Ever Global. So also good to hear you talk about empowering. That's what I heard. I heard you say that you help women of color in the workplace, who you're right, are the most discriminated against. I've seen that as an employment law attorney over the years, unfortunately. And to let them know that they have more choices than just suffer silently or quit. So I heard the empowerment piece. So I appreciate, the backstory there, what personally and professionally preceded you getting to all paths lead to now, right where you are now. So I thought maybe that's a good segue into our first question about this topic, which you've lived and experienced, which is, in what ways, right, has the pandemic, I would say, affected rates of implicit bias and discrimination and had disparate impact for people of color in the workplace? But I'm also wondering, a point you had raised when we spoke, how has the pandemic perhaps illuminated, shown a light on already existing sort of the two tracks between women of color in the workplace and white men or women in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question, Eric. And we definitely agree that the pandemic, it revealed long-standing biases, right? Discrimination, which have been taking place for a long time, right? And we saw it, in a new way, or in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. And so, some of the disparities that were exposed and exacerbated are, number one, disparities in pay, right? Women of color consistently earn less than their white male and female counterparts, right? And that's anywhere between about 62 to 54 cents on the dollar. On top of that, women of color are less likely to have access to savings, right? So in a time when job loss was happening left and right, women of color had fewer resources to fall back on. At the same time, women of color are more often heads of households, right? So, they have family members who are dependent on them for care, right? So, there are those disparities. In addition to, there were higher rates of mortality from COVID-19 in many communities of color, right? So, we see that there was, sort of greater economic and care responsibilities for women of color, for their families and for their communities, which then also exacerbated the workplace pressure during the pandemic, right? It increased their need for support, for flexibility. And, what we see is that workplaces weren't necessarily ready to fill in with those supports or with those policies to provide women of color the support that they needed in order to fulfill their job responsibilities, in addition to the increased responsibilities of care and around stress that came with the pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Sarah. It's kind of a 1-2 punch from COVID, wasn't it? I mean, you had like the disease itself sort of targeting, for lack of a better term, but impacting women of color, people of color, much more with higher morbidity rates. And then, of course, I think people had less access to certain healthcare and resources. And then there's the pressure of the workplace changing, but women of color having less savings to fall back on, and statistically having higher rates of responsibilities as head of the household, often than some of their white counterparts. So I can see how it's definitely a sort of a 1-2 punch there of impact on women and women of color. And just to be working from home remotely, or not have, say, the opportunities, I imagine, for certain childcare needs that are pressing. Maybe they don't have the resources for, say, a live-in nanny that might be afforded to someone who's been climbing the ladder socially and economically because of their white, perhaps male, frankly, status that makes it easier to do so. So I definitely hear this topic being presented in different ways, like different angles, a lot, different perspectives, I should say. And I think it's a really good point you raised. We actually have to take our first commercial break, but we'll come right back with more on this topic. We'll talk about some of the emotional and psychological factors at play that might be blinding business owners to their role as implicit bias. So I'll just say for the audience tonight, I'm Eric Sauber, host of Employment Law Today. My guest tonight, Ms. Emily Williams. Please stick around. We'll be right back.
Are you a business owner? Do you want to be a business owner? Do you work with business owners? Hi, I'm Stephen Fry, your small and medium-sized business or SMB guy, and I'm the host of the new show, Always Friday. While I love to have fun on my show, we take those Friday feelings of freedom and clarity to discuss popular topics on the minds of SMBs today. Please join me and my various special guests on Friday at 11 a.m. on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant. And on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, Thursdays, 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
Are you on edge? Hey, we live in challenging, edgy times, so let's lean in. I'm Sandra Bargman, the host of The Edge of Every Day, which airs each Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on talkradio.nyc. Tune in live with me and my friends and colleagues as we share stories and perspectives about pushing boundaries and exploring our rough edges. That's The Edge of Every Day on Mondays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
Welcome back to Employment Law Today. Once again, I'm your host, Eric Sauber. My guest tonight is Emily Williams, coach advocate for people of color in the workplace and founder of Forward Ever Global. Emily, we're talking tonight, for those that may have joined us late, we're talking about the dual pandemic of COVID-19 in the workforce and how it's impacted women of color. And that last question, I realize we got to take a commercial break to be cut short into your answer, but I want to hear more if you have to share about working from home and the disparities, the examples of implicit bias and discrimination, if you'd like to elaborate.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So the other point that I wanted to make is that, long-standing stereotypes about women of color in the workplace, a devaluation of their labor, also impacted their mobility within employment, right? And then access to jobs, high-paying jobs and also jobs with great benefits, right? So when we see these things taken together, how it did exacerbate long-standing inequities, and created hardship, precarity, and economic loss for many women of color.
I think that's a good point, Emily. These inequities didn't just arrive during COVID. I think they've been, preceded by years of discrimination that may have disproportionately, or in fact, not even may have, but let's be honest, has have disproportionately left women of color with less resources, lower positions, the pay gap you mentioned, the pay inequity. So when this pandemic hit, there are often less choices, both in the internal job and then with the workforce itself for changing careers or job. I think that's an interesting point you raised about the fact that these disparities have existed long before COVID. COVID just perhaps combination of shining a flashlight, as you said, revealing it, and also maybe throwing gasoline on the fire, just making it harder for women of color. Have you seen any examples of, say, women in different age groups being affected differently, younger versus older workers, or have you seen it kind of just quick across the board, women of color being hit harder at the workplace by the pandemic?
Yeah, I would say the most important distinction that I've seen is the distinction between women of color who were able to work from home during the pandemic and those who, were essential workers and had to show up on the front lines during the pandemic. So when we look at women of color who had to show up on the front lines, many of them working in, the medical field, home health aides in certain industries, they, one, were risking, the possibility of contracting the virus every day as they went to work. Yeah. Two, there were fewer protections for them if they couldn't show up for work for a day, right? And also, we saw increasing stressors around needs for childcare, right? Yeah. So I think that that's an important distinction to make. And as they were deemed essential workers, they had fewer protections in some of the emergency relief packages that we saw that came to benefit some workers. So I think, and I think in contrast, for women of color who were able to work from home, we saw a very different scenario, right? We saw that many women of color, had the time in the space to actually come to terms with how workplace cultures had been impacting their well-being, right? Their professional success. Because in the first time in recent history, in mass, we were able to, we didn't have to show up to the office, right? So we had a reprieve from the daily microaggressions, right? There were particular individuals, who maybe were bullying or demonstrating other toxic behavior with whom we didn't have to interact with. And so I think that, work from home actually worked in the opposite way for women of color who were able to do that, because so many were able to realize, or begin to come to terms with the racial trauma that they have experienced at the workplace. I think I think many women of color have said, it's not worth my well-being, right? It's not worth my health. And I think it's interesting to note that, microaggressions are no better for women of color in 2021 than they were in 2019, right? That is even amidst this, sort of renewed commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion that so many companies and organizations made, right? So I think, again, we have the scenario in which long-standing biases, long-standing inequities were exposed, even when women of color were able to work from home.
Yeah, it sounds as if, so now I'm kind of hearing in that answer, interesting point, Emily, I'm hearing like the 1-2 punch of the pandemic in terms of women of color who are separated from their white colleagues, but also the disparate impact of women of color who are essential workers, whether it be in healthcare or home health aides or nursing homes or in, say, the grocery stores, people who say it didn't have the protections like that a lot of their white counterparts might have had in other professions. So I hear it's interesting, right? You have two things going on there, I guess. You've got, as you said, I'm hearing you say women of color who were showing up and they're saying, I'm risking my life, right? I'm getting less protection than some of my white colleagues who are for colleagues and peers, neighbors, family members, or friends rather, who are not having to risk their life and show up and for this maybe crappy pay or low pay that they start to realize this is not my worth. And then you have women of color who perhaps maybe had higher level positions and they were maybe working from home remotely, but being away from the daily grind, the daily microaggressions, it's like getting a new pair of glasses, right? If your glasses are old prescription, you get used to that until you go to the eye doctor and you get them upgraded. You're like, wow, I can actually see, at my age, I can read again, when you get progressives. But you get used to this is sort of squinting and kind of going like this, for the longest time. And then I think maybe being removed from that daily situation of the discriminatory boss, the workplace bully, and in many cases, those two titles, right, go hand in hand. Bullying and racism are often put sides of the same coin. So I think it's interesting to note that. And then to me, it brings up the great resignation kind of question that so many people in the great resignation are often white people, not people of color, yet you see more women of color expressing and recognizing dissatisfaction with their work. What does that tell you about the inequity of choice and mobility, right, for many women of color in the workforce compared to some of their white male or female counterparts, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. It was 4.4 million people left their jobs in September 2021 alone, right? Just that month alone. And 1 in 3 women are ready to leave their jobs, right? And that's even higher for women of color. So, I think it tells us something about how unhealthy, how toxic, and how out of alignment with our personal well-being many workplace cultures have been, right? That people are ready to say, listen, I can no longer sacrifice my health and well-being for this job. I have to find another way. And many women are leaving even without, having another job lined up, right? I mean, that used to be something that was very ill-advised, and now very different considerations. And I think, absent a global pandemic, I don't know that people would have made the same evaluations, right? So I think in that way, the pandemic has contributed to what I hope will be some really positive shifts in workplace culture as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Emily, you make. It's I think it's kind of a reckoning of sorts, the idea that, it took a pandemic, and that's something telling, right? It took a almost 2-year now life-threatening illness on a daily basis, with all the trauma that it brought of, sickness, illness, and death, to perhaps maybe shake people up to say, let me evaluate my life. What's really important, or can I really, is this worth tolerating, And I think that when we're in the kind of caught in the bump and grind, the mix of things, the daily grind, I like the term that you may have noticed, before COVID, it's easy to kind of just go along with it. And yeah, this is rough, but I'm just gonna go with it anyway. And then when people start to lose relatives in their 40s and 30s and 50s from this terrible virus, and when we lose people and people lose their businesses, their livelihood, I think it makes them kind of take stock. A disaster can do that sometimes. So, and fascinating to note that I think women of color actually might be maybe a positive shift, might be a reckoning sort of with the whole Great Resignation. I actually want to get back into that point because I hear pushback from many employers and business owners, as you can imagine, being an employment law attorney. And I feel like this is like put kind of a counter to what they're saying. So, but we need to take our second commercial break. So I hope everyone's really getting a lot from this so far. There's more to come. We're going to talk about how Emily helps businesses to recognize and remedy some of this discrimination and why you should care as a business owner, how this is, it's good for everyone, good for the employees and good for you, the employer. So stick around to Talk Radio NYC. I'm your host of Employment Law Today, Eric Sauver. My guest, Emily Williams. We'll be right back.
Franklin McElroy, host of the new podcast, Gateway to the Smokies. It airs on talkradio.nyc every Tuesday night from 6 p.m. to 7. Every episode is dedicated to memorable experiences in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and surrounding areas. This show features experts and locals who will expound upon the richness of culture, history, and adventure that awaits you in the Smokies. Tune in every Tuesday from 6 p.m. to 7 on talkradio.nyc.
Are you passionate about the conversation around racism? Hi, I'm Reverend Dr. TLC, host of the Dismantle Racism Show, which airs every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern on talkradio.nyc. Join me and my amazing guests as we discuss ways to uncover, dismantle, and eradicate racism. That's Thursdays at 11 o'clock a.m. on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a small business trying to navigate the COVID-19 related employment laws? Hello, I'm Eric Sauver, employment law, business law attorney, and host of the new radio show, Employment Law Today. On my show, we'll have guests to discuss the common employment law challenges business owners are facing during these trying times. Tune in on Tuesday evenings from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc, now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to Employment Law Today. I'm your host, Eric Sauver. I'm an employment law and business law attorney in New York State. And I'm here tonight with my guest, Emily Williams. Emily is the president and founder of Go Whatever Global. We're talking about COVID-19, so the dual pandemic for women of color, right? Discrimination and COVID-19. And the Great Resignation is not the whole topic, but I think it's certainly an interesting part of this. And I wanted to touch upon, like Emily's answer to that last question about how many, I think, or some women of color are noticing their toxicity in their workplace, saying, hey, this is too much for me, I need to protect myself from harm, I'm gonna quit my job because I don't have another one. So what I noticed is that some business owners and employers, they view that phenomenon, they view the quitting, the Great Resignation very differently. Maybe it's from their own bias, but they see it as that workers don't appreciate what they have, that these are just sort of entitled generation of millennials, even though there are a number of Gen Xers and other generations in this Great Resignation. But it's a kind of attitude that things are kind of already good at the workplace. So if you don't walk away from a job, you just don't have, I guess, what it takes. You don't want to face tough situations. So I'm wondering, they made me think about, and you shared the other perspective, right? Which is, no, people are facing discrimination at work. They're facing toxicity, lack of pay gaps and pay inequities based on race and gender, women of color being mistreated very often, and deciding to that vein to leave. So it brings you to a question of, do you think there's some emotional, maybe, or psychological factors that can play that might be, like, say, blinding some business owners to the discriminating impact that COVID has in terms of COVID workplace policies?
I do, Eric. I think, when you're bringing up that point, what it reminds me of is that our culture of work for, the last several decades has been, very much based on, sort of individualism, hard work, right? That notion of meritocracy, you have to, sort of like make it on your own. And I think people have realized how negatively that has impacted, many people's health, right? So, when you're saying that there are CEOs, business owners who see the Great Resignation very differently, I'm not surprised. And I think one of the most important things, that I stress to leaders all the time is that we have to also listen to what, our employees are saying, right? We would also be remiss, Eric, if we did not also talk about the wave of employee activism that also came about during the pandemic, very much related to racial justice and, the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, right? And so we see employees in mass are saying, they're demanding a different culture, right? I think that, CEOs, business owners, managers would be well served to listen, right? It is absolutely time for a change. And, we can see that that's happening, whether or not CEOs and owners are on board, right? But I think it's a much better place if we can have conversations so that we can truly have a workplace that actually works for everyone.
Oh, sorry, what you're saying works for everyone, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to, answer your question, it can be very hard to comment on whether, a business owner fails to recognize that there is a discriminatory impact of, particular policy or practice, whether, a business owner is willfully ignoring if and when they happen, right? It's just be hard to comment on.
That thin line, right? That kind of like blurry line of when it's ignoring, willfully, sort of burying head in the sand, because it's like unpleasant to look at, or just oblivious, unaware of. Maybe oblivious is like a derogatory term to use. Maybe just like uninformed, right? Oblivious has the connotation of being like, if I tell a client of mine, an employer, I think you're oblivious to the employee's point of view. That term has that negative connotation of, you're clueless, and so the pushback is, what do you mean I'm oblivious? But what I hear you say is, let's listen to the employee's experience. So let's listen to their story, their narrative, right? And I tell this to clients, I get pushback, but I explain is that if you actually listen to the employee's perspective and they have some input in the policies, it may be a little uncomfortable at first, but in the long run, you'll have a more harmonious company with less discrimination and fewer lawsuits. Sometimes you have to do the painful work, right, of sort of introspection and self-reflection to get to a better place. And I think, right, that's
absolutely. I agree with that. And we know that when employees feel heard, when they feel supported, and when they have time and space to do the work in the ways that they need, they actually perform much better, right? And they'll stay at their workplace much longer than if they're, sort of constantly bumping up against, a management structure that's not listening to them, or that's providing resistance in response to them raising concerns that in many cases, that they certainly feel are valid, and I would likely agree. And I think too, sort of psychologically, it can be, there can be a lot of fear associated with admitting discriminatory impact or admitting discrimination, right? And so I think employers, shy away from that. But, with the amount of research about discrimination against people of color, against women of color, particularly, and the amount of expertise that's available to help address those problems, I would really encourage, business owners, CEOs, managers to really be proactive about, sort of addressing their policies and practices to ensure that they are not discriminatory in nature or in impact.
Absolutely, Emily, 100%. I agree with you 100% there. It's interesting because what I hear you saying, there are a few things. I hear, number one, I hear you saying that maybe some of the, perhaps the blocks, right, the defensiveness from employers or owners of companies recognizing like discrimination might be from their not listening to and hearing the experience of their, say, employees, women of color, people of color. Because like, if you don't hear their experience, say, and your belief system is that like, the workplace is 100% a meritocracy where we're all even and hard work gets rewarded and laziness does not, then you're going to, of course, be, well, why are people quitting? Why don't they just work hard if they want to get better place? But if they hear that someone has been working very hard, here's the 60-hour week, say young, associate at a firm who's Black and female and getting passed over for promotions or harassed or microaggression is headed, is that lobbied her way. It's hard to, to hear that, really take it in and not change your perspective. I think I agree with you that, it's in everyone's interest, like the employees and the employers, to point this out. And to your point, it's hard to admit racism in the workplace because we're so afraid there'll be some harsh punishment. Maybe that speaks to, like, do we need to look at discrimination when it's over? Maybe swift punishment is required, but if it's implicit in certain policies, needs to be rooted out and viewed and changed. Does this harsh sort of penal like punishment approach, like, does it like stall progress? Like, our leaders saying, I don't want to talk about this issue because I'm afraid there'll be a lawsuit from this. And that's maybe an interesting point, I wonder to.
Well, Eric, it's interesting because, in my experience, it's much more often the case that, women of color actually have raised their concerns, and they experience retaliation in response, right? Which then led to more harsher consequences for the company or the organization. So, even from a legal standpoint, employers would be well served to actually listen and believe women of color when they come forward the first time, right? Because then it doesn't have to go to the lengths of a lawsuit or other legal consequences, because the woman of color was listened to and the organization addressed her concerns and actually addressed the problem, right? But so oftentimes we don't see that, right? And that goes back to, in some cases, back to these earlier points where I made about the stereotypes about women of color, how their contributions are not always valued in the workplace. That creates problems for employers as well.
Absolutely, very good point there. Well, I think really well made that point. And yeah, I think we really need to take a look at these issues in the workplace, and they're complex and they're deeply rooted, I think, in generations of belief systems about one another. And I think to your point that women need to be heard and listened to. What I was to say about that, you mentioned the legal aspects. I litigate for a living, defend companies and try to get them to comply with the law. And I represent employees as well. I can't tell you how many times, like a lawsuit, maybe when you boil it down, somewhere along the line, communication broke down, which either led to discriminatory events occurring or being condoned, or led to some miscommunication and some hard feelings that led to, say, someone that perhaps may have stayed and worked out an issue instead leaving and suing. So it's really, I think, important. I think it's a good point you raised, and it's appreciate all your feedback is great. I mean, it kind of brings you to a question, which I was about to ask you, but I think we're coming up on another commercial break. I'll take that first, and then I'll ask the question. Or actually, maybe I can perhaps pose a question to you to think about, you which is maybe a little more about what is the employee side perspective that you've been hearing. You talked about listening to the employees. So what are some maybe concrete examples? You gave some before, but if maybe we can take that on the break, after the break, I should say. For now, I'll say we need to go to a commercial break. You're watching or listening to Employment Law Today. My guest tonight, very, very informed, very, very articulate Emily Williams. And so stick around. We'll be right back.
Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern for the Mind Behind Leadership, where we focus on what leadership really means to us and to others. We have practical discussions with the CEOs of some of the world's largest companies, owners of small businesses, and experts in psychology and behavior to get that inside track, what to do, what to avoid, and what really happens. Join me, Graham Dobbin, at the new time, 4 p.m. every Tuesday for the Mind Behind Leadership, here live on talkradio.nyc.
Hey everybody, it's Tommy D, the nonprofit sector connector, coming at you from my attic. Each week here on talkradio.nyc, I host a program, Philanthropy in Focus. Nonprofits impact us each and every day, and it's my focus to help them amplify their message and tell their story. Listen each week at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time until 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on talkradio.nyc.
Calling all pet lovers.
Pet Avengers, assemble!
On the Professionals and Animal Lovers show, we believe the bond between animal lovers is incredibly strong. It mirrors that bond between pets and their owners. Through this program, we come together to learn, educate, and advocate.
Join us live every Wednesday at 2 p.m. at talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to Employment Law Today. I'm your host, Eric Sommer, an employment law and business law attorney. Here tonight with my guest, Emily Williams. I should mention also what Emily does. I mentioned at the beginning, she is a dedicated coach, advocate for women of color in the workplace, a DEI consultant specialist, and she founded her company, Forward for Global. So I just had one quick question from earlier, Emily, because you've given so much detail leading up to the question I was going to ask you, but maybe is there one example of like an employee side perspective that you're hearing most women of color as to how they're being harmed by some of the pandemic related workplace policies? I know you gave a few examples, but any others you could think of?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that's really important to talk about that is not necessarily pandemic related, but that has come about in the pandemic is that women of color have really been tasked with doing much of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And that has come, that's a workload that's in addition to their regular work responsibilities. And in many cases, that has not come with additional pay or recognition, right? And so, I hear that time and again that, women of color really want their employers to take diversity, equity, and inclusion seriously. One way that they can do that is by compensating, those who are doing the work, but also integrating that into the leadership models within the organization, right? There's a real call to go beyond diversity statements, right? That we really do need to integrate this into the workplace culture in more ways than, a one-off training, for example.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that we're seeing just huge amounts of burnout, right? As particularly women have, are juggling their jobs. Also, when children are in and out of school, even still, that's increased pressure, it's increased stress. And so we're seeing a lot of burnout, right? And so, many of my clients are also calling for workplace policies that really do address workplace burnout and also just provide more flexibility.
Those are great examples. Thank you for that. Really great, I think, pardon me, specifics about what women of color in the workplace are experiencing. And yes, it's, companies can invite people to the table to share their experience, but don't task them with basically being a de facto enforcer of, all the diversity and equity initiatives, and if you're going to do that, offer compensation for the extra work.
Right.
I think it's really good points, and Speaking of work, I want to talk a little bit about your work, right? So I mentioned several times that you founded your company, Forward Ever Global, which, as I think you mentioned, addresses microaggressions in the workplace and coaches women of color to thrive despite everyday challenges at work. So I guess my question for you is, can you tell us, how do you specifically help businesses to recognize and remedy some of their, let's say, discriminatory policies that we spoke about, that maybe disproportionately damage and impact women of color in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is what do you do at Forward Ever Global?
Thanks for that question, Eric. I appreciate it. We have a 4-part process to address microaggressions in the workplace. And that process includes a structural and policy analysis to determine if there are any exclusions of women of color or people of color, and if there are any negative impacts on those groups. And that's a consultative process. So we really sit down with members of those groups and then make policy recommendations to the employers about what they need, and then also if any of the policies need to be amended. We also offer one-to-one advising to business owners and to employers, particularly to assist them in getting outside of their comfort zones so that they can effectively lead these shifts, right, to become a more inclusive, a more responsive organization. And our advising results in increased trust from their employees, increased respect from their employees, and then increased integrity as a leader. And then finally, one of the biggest complaints that I get from women of color is that they do not have the support that they need to navigate the unique challenges that we experience in the workplace. So we offer a community that provides expert coaching and resources to support women in navigating these everyday challenges. And we do offer a company membership to that community for women of color.
So that's the great right there services that you've got, the consulting, the advising, the supportive structure in place. And so working with the businesses and the owners, but also working with the employees as well. It's interesting how a lot of companies take an either or approach, like they're on the employer side or employee side, I think, which shows the dichotomy, right? As a, one versus the other, sort of A versus B instead of A and B working together. Interesting. And you work with companies, I think, here, locally, nationally, like what is your reach beyond the New York State, or rather New York City metro area, or is it throughout the country, or?
Yeah, we work with companies nationally. Yes,
right,
all across the country, not only on the East Coast.
Right. I think it's interesting. Must be interesting to see. I imagine sort of some of the differences in issues across the country, and yet some of the stark, perhaps, similarities where you can be in Wyoming or New York City and be a person of color in the workforce, and have maybe some of the same stories of microaggression. I imagine you might be there thinking, I've seen this before. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's actually much more common that that I'm noting the similarities with respect to women of color's experiences, but also with respect to how the organization or an employer responds. I think that also speaks to sort of what has been normalized in our workplace cultures over the last several decades. So there's not much geographic difference in the problems that come up or the responses. And, Eric, to your earlier point, at Forward Ever Global, we really do see it as two sides of the same coin. One, coaching women of color to navigate the challenges that they experience every day at work, and supporting their leadership and advocacy for policies that will improve the situation, while also working with the leaders of that organization or of that workplace to shift the culture, right? Because we shouldn't only have to rely on women of color to come forward and say, listen, change needs to happen because people are being harmed, right? We also need organizations to be proactive in saying, listen, we stand for something better. We stand for a different culture. And so we're embarking on this process. When we have action on both ends, on both sides of the coin, then we see progress, right? Then we see shifts in organizational cultures.
Yes, I think that's a really good point, Emily. It really is. It really is like I like the phrase you use, two sides of the same coin, really, and that they work in synergy with each other, which I think is, when you think about it, sort of the underlying ideal or the model of an ideal business or company or plant is that like you've got harmony between the workers and the employers and the employees, right? The employment, let's say the owner, the managers, the supervisors who hire folks to get the work done, and then the actual sort of worker bees who get things like completed and get tasks all covered, taken care of. And if that's like out of alignment, it's like not about, say, taking a side of one versus the other, but trying to bring them both to the same side of the table. I think a good negotiator would often say, what commonalities do we have here between the parties? How can we bring them towards like a common objective, which might look different for different sides of it, but I think the ultimate objective might be the same, right? The employee wants to have a workplace like where they can feel safe and valued and work without the interruptions of discrimination, and the employer wants a productive employee who's happy and getting their work done. So I think it's a win. Yeah, win-win that you provide. And we've got 3 minutes left in the show. It goes so fast when you're having fun. I really believe that. I love doing the show every week. So at this point in the show, I usually turn the mic over to you for 2 minutes. You can kind of share about how can we reach you, your contact information, if you have anything coming up, your own podcast, workshop, or a book. You get 2 minutes. The floor is yours, and I'll take us out.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Eric. This has been a wonderful interview. So you can find me at LinkedIn, Emily R. Williams. And, there's many videos regarding workplace culture and the impacts for women of color on my LinkedIn page. You can also visit our website at www.forwardeverglobal.com. And then you can also reach me directly at emily@forwardeverglobal.com.
Okay, considering that information, great to know. And I guess you work with companies in different parts of the country, as you mentioned. Always good for people to have that in mind, that we can work with different organizations and people alike. And so I think we had such a great topic tonight. Really hope people can take it to heart, just what we were discussing, and hear with an open mind, right? And whatever side philosophy you might have. I would say, for those listening tonight, tune in Tuesdays at 5 p.m., 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we have guests such as Emily Williams and others who talk about the most cutting edge issues that employers face and business owners face as well. And we'll delve into some of these hard conversations that are ultimately worth having. So you can tune in Tuesdays at 5 at Talk Radio NYC. I'm your host, Eric Sauver. And is there any parting message that's putting you on the spot there? Anything sort of a phrase, a message of hope you might have? We have a minute left in the show. I'm going to give you another.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, I would just again encourage business owners, employers to really listen when women of color come forward with a complaint or with a statement about something relating to the culture. Not only is that better for the workplace, it's also better for the woman of color. And I think that there is a positive future when we do that.
Excellent. Emily Williams, thank you so much once again. Folks, I'm your host, Eric Sauver, Employment Law Today. Tune in, stay tuned, rather Talk Radio NYC, more great programs, and we'll see you back next week. Emily, thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Yep.